So today's panel will look at the role of domestic violence and addiction, homelessness, adverse childhood experiences, and incarceration. And we'll kind of talk about some of the overlap that we experience and why that may be, a lot of the rates. So we have some really awesome panelists that will be here and that have joined us. So I will go ahead and start introducing those panelists, and then we can get started. As we facilitate this, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. You are also more than welcome to unmute yourself and ask. You can also direct message me and I will ask the question if you are not comfortable asking on a public platform. So that being said, we'll go ahead and start. Megan just messaged and she is not able to join, but we do have three awesome panelists. So Tara is the Education Outreach Coordinator with Mary Abbott House. She's been there since February 2019. Prior to working at Mary Abbott House, she worked as a domestic violence, sexual violence advocate while studying women and gender studies at OU. At the Mary Abbott House, she is responsible for a statewide community education program called Safety in Action, where she educates adults on how to recognize and report the signs of child abuse and neglect in Oklahoma. Tara, you want to say hi?
Hi, thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Dr. David Mccloud. He has spent the last 2 decades working to actively reduce violence, particularly that directed at people in communities with diminished capacities for self-protection. In addition to being an associate professor at the School for Social Work, he holds affiliate faculty status with the OU Department of Women and Gender Studies and the OU Center for Social Justice. He's also the director of the OU Knee Center for Strong Families, a former police detective who transitioned to become a forensic social worker. Dr. Mccloud has taught undergraduate and graduate courses and programs of social work, criminal justice, and preparing for future faculty. His research is focused on the intersection of criminal behavior, development, gender, and trauma. Some of Dr. Mccloud's current professional activities include investigations of forensic psychopathology, and differential criminal behavior development, female sexual offending, female incarceration, child sexual abuse, forensic social work, interpersonal and multidisciplinary collaboration, domestic and relational violence, and social work education. Dr. Mccloud is a board member of the National Organization for Forensic Social Work, the co-chair of Oklahoma Children of Incarcerated Parents Advisory Committee to the legislature, and is currently working on multiple funded research projects. His most recent publications include work on female sexual offending, trauma, domestic violence, and social work education. He's won numerous awards for teaching, service, and research honors. And he is a 4-time recipient of the Ann and Henry Zarrow School of Social Work Professor of the Year Award. Dr. Mccloud, you want to say hi to everyone?
Yeah, I think I've taken up enough time with my bio, but I'm glad to be here, and I'm thankful to be a part of the conversation.
All right, and the next panelist is Brittni Ware. Brittni Ware is from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. She attended Langston University, where she graduated magna cum laude with her Bachelor of Arts in Psychology. I'm so sorry. Brittni continued her education journey, pursuing her master's in human relations with an emphasis on counseling at the University of Oklahoma. In 2006, with the vision of wanting to change the lives of those affected by mental health and substance use, Brittni began her career as a rehabilitation specialist working with children experiencing problems with behaviors as a result of mental health. In 2009, after obtaining her master's degree, she accomplished another goal by entering the arena of psychotherapy as a therapist. Brittni practiced therapy while under supervision, working with low-income individuals in a plethora of settings from day treatment to school-based. In 2012, she became a licensed alcohol and drug counselor. In 2017, Brittni became employed with the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health Substance Abuse Services. I always forget what that acronym stands for. Her passion in life remains the same, which is to help alter the lives of those affected by mental health and substance use. Brittni, you want to say hi?
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to explore such a great topic.
All right. So as I mentioned, feel free to add any comments or ask any questions in the chat. And I will get started. So I do have some questions prepared, but definitely feel free. We want to make this about you all and make sure that every panelist has the opportunity to ask those questions. So the first, can you all share a little bit about what exactly an ACE score is, like what an adverse childhood experience is and why it's so important?
Yeah, I don't know if anybody wants to take a swing at it. I can try to do a quick explanation, but adverse childhood experiences, a lot of us work probably know a lot about this. So I'll just do a real Cliff Notes version, but a couple of decades ago, the CDC set out to try to understand how adversity in childhood can impact people later on in life. And it's become over time a really solid measurement or metric that we can use to gauge trauma in childhood and overall wellness and safety in childhood. We use it in a lot of contexts, in a lot of research, and a lot of practice settings. So the quick version is there are 10 items on the instrument that can gauge experiences. Those are in two basic clusters. About half of those are connected to lived experiences, so physical abuse, sexual abuse, maltreatment, etc. Then about 5 of them are connected more with household dysfunction. So things like, was your mother treated violently? Which years ago, that was spousal abuse. Mother now we might expand that a little bit, but was there domestic violence or family or relational violence in the home? Was someone in the home struggling with substance abuse or addiction? Was someone in the home or immediate family incarcerated or arrested for even a short period of time? All of these ACEs come together. You can have a score of 0 to 10. Oklahoma actually is leading the country, or at least at the very top of the country in regards to our ACE scores. I think it's everyone that we serve is on there. I think some interesting research that I've been a part of has also shown that people who are drawn to helping professions, we actually have a higher likelihood than not to also have our own high ACE scores. So having ACEs does not mean your life will be bad. It doesn't necessarily measure that direction. And we know there are a lot of things that can mediate for ACEs. However, when we look at, for example, incarcerated people and look backwards toward ACEs, we know that overwhelmingly that childhood adversity was present in their life. So it's a really helpful metric, but doesn't mean everything too. So that's kind of what I try to let people know. Oh, Danielle, you're there.
Does anyone else have anything they would like to add?
No, he covered the bases with it.
Yeah, that was more than a Cliff Notes. That was like everything you needed to know in a couple minutes. That was great.
I had to practice that one before. Promise not to talk the whole time.
So the next question, what role does Oklahoma's high rates of ACE scores have on the rates of addiction, homelessness, incarceration, and domestic abuse in Oklahoma?
So I think the thing to be mindful of is that those experiences that one may have, oftentimes we have to figure out ways to kind of cope in to deal with some of the experiences that we've had. And so some individuals choose to cope in a way that may not be healthy to some of us. And so that feeds into a lot of the high rates of substance usage. And so whenever I come across an individual, whether it's a survivor or whether it's just someone that I've had as a client who has concerns in the area of substance abuse, that's the first thing that I actually think about is they're trying to cope with something that they've experienced. And it may be helpful for us to explore what healthy coping looks like, as well as help them to understand what those triggers may be for that type of coping.
And I just wanted to kind of build on that. A lot of the work that I do at Abbott House, we're looking at that multi-generational cycle. So a lot of this also comes down to what interventions are in place in community support, because we know that not everyone is coming from the same background. We don't all have the same foundations. So what extra supports are available in the community to help create that healthy foundation, break that cycle, and break that multi-generational cycle for all future generations? So all of the services and the agencies that we work with, we're looking at where are intervention points, and it's not always a caregiver at home who's providing that support and foundation in childhood. We look for teachers, coaches, neighbors, family, friends. So it's also being aware of just the availability for that community support, which is so important for every single person.
Absolutely.
I think, and I came to understand ACEs through studying criminal behavior. And if we know that in Oklahoma, ACEs are this kind of incredible predictor of a trajectory in life that leads you toward the criminal justice system. In studying women specifically in Oklahoma, and I'll talk about this at different points in the conversation today, I'm sure, but incarcerated women in Oklahoma, and by the way, we incarcerate women at a rate that's like 15 times that of Afghanistan, in case you're curious. Like, right, so incarcerated women in Oklahoma, I think the average ACE score is somewhere about a 5.5. And we know that around almost 40% of the incarcerated women in Oklahoma actually have an ACE score that's 7 or higher. So extreme ACEs in the life trajectories of these women.
So kind of building on, taking a shift a little bit to homelessness, up to 57% of women and children who are experiencing homelessness and due to domestic violence, sorry, let me just restart that. So up to 57% of women and children who are experiencing homelessness are homeless due to domestic violence, and 44% of women experiencing homelessness have put off leaving due to domestic violence to avoid being homeless, so that they, what can be done to help prevent people from having to choose between being homeless and being safe?
There are so many different factors that, Danielle, I know that we see quite a bit here at Palomar. I'm connected with the Department of Mental Health. However, I'm embedded at Palomar. So we see a variety of survivors that come in. You have some that may not be open to taking their children and their pets to a shelter. And so they may make a decision to go against that, or they may make a decision to stay in the setting that they're in. Then you have some that have children that are older, or they may be males, and they may not be the right fit for some of those shelters. You have some survivors that have pets that, you know, some of the shelters are not pet friendly. You have some survivors that don't do well in a large group setting. And sometimes when you're in a shelter setting, you have a number of different individuals with different personalities and their own experiences. And so that makes it challenging. Those are just some of the survivors that we come in contact day to day. And I believe that that has a large role in the homelessness that we actually experience.
I think that some of it, from when I used to work in the shelter, I encountered a lot of individuals, they felt a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. I think that in general, public messaging, support, and understanding has come a long way from where it used to be around understanding domestic violence, understanding these intersections, but there is still a stigma, and a lot of people might be fearful to disclose to someone that they can trust, to seek out those supportive services. So that's another huge barrier of, do I feel like I'm going to feel shame, or do I feel guilty for asking for this assistance, and going through those personal journeys with them seeking help, and also understanding that they are experiencing domestic violence and it's not their fault. But there are people who want to help them and their families be safe, but it's just making that first step to connect that bridge.
I think, and just to build on what both Brittni and Tara said, like we know that childhood adversity leads to unhealthy relationships, right? And so understanding the psychology of someone who's been living in this environment, oftentimes it's scary to leave. There's just this haunting, looming fear, and also a great deal of mistrust. It makes sense that it may be easier or less anxiety producing to try to live on your own, or to try to stay, or to try to not rock the boat. We've done a lot of research that connects coercion and control and the psychological and emotional abuse that people feel is the actual main cloud of abuse. The hitting, the acts are things to try to keep somebody under control. So our legal system can recognize that if somebody gets hit, but they don't recognize that day-to-day, 24 hours a day manipulation and threat and the psychological toll that takes on someone. So for someone to be willing to reach out or even feel safe in accepting services like shelter, that's a really tough thing to get people connected from. It's a tough bridge to try to cross to get that trust built.
Can I add one more thing too?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of our survivors are coming from environments to where the person using violence is the breadwinner. And so oftentimes that plays a role as well.
I had one thing that you both reminded me of, especially when children are involved. When we have that coercion and control, sometimes the children are used as a way for the abuser to manipulate the situation and incite fear in the victim or survivor that's trying to leave, that you won't see the children again, or I'll make sure that you can't take the children or the animals if they have pets with you. And so for a lot of individuals, there's that fear as well of, well, I've seen what they've done before, so I don't want to leave my children or my pets in this situation. And also so many other hurdles of then we might involve child protective services. If they're married, then we get into the legality around custody. So there are all these other factors as well. And oftentimes abusers will use the children or pets as that manipulation factor for survivors.
And what we found in the research, absolutely, to both of those points, is that it's more, if you're an abuser, using the children is actually even more effective a mechanism to control your partner than hitting them. Homicide is not as powerful as using the kids from the survivor's perspective. So that's an incredibly important one. Access to the kids, and then if you go to court, do you have the finances to be able to fight? So lots of social problems, feminization of poverty, income inequity, all those things play a role in there too.
One more thing. I'm sorry, you guys are each just making me come to a lot of thoughts are coming to surface. The other thing is that you have some moms who may not have been raised in a home with mom and dad. And so the guilt of pulling their children from a two-parent household also plays a factor too.
Absolutely, that was some great discussion. What role does substance abuse or use play into a lack of opportunities for shelter or services for housing?
You want to go, Brittni?
You can go, Terry.
Okay, so I know when I was again working in the shelter, a lot of times there was this extra, they could not use or currently be using any substances or have any substances with them to enter shelter. And for a lot of individuals, they understand the fear, they understand the danger of being in an abusive situation, but to also add on top of that, entering brand new sobriety while they're already in a cycle of trauma, that's a lot. And so oftentimes individuals would ask for other alternatives. Do you have anywhere else that I could stay? Because if you have substance use as a coping mechanism and they're already in a cycle of trauma and violence, to also add that on top of it it's a lot. And I don't think many people with presented with that, like on the crisis line or even in a face-to-face, to make that decision in that moment, it's very difficult. I know that's why most shelters, we have like that open door. If it's not today, we're here tomorrow or in a month. But we have to meet with that understanding and understand that if they are making a decision to not enter shelter at that time, it isn't a judgment on them or where they're at. It's we need to work with them to how can we best keep you safe? Because for many, shelter in that moment or even entering certain housing programs, that might not be the best option for where they're at in their level of substance use or just mentally where they're at.
Anyone have anything they want to add? So this has already been hinted on a little bit, but research shows that both child and adult abuse have been documented among one of the most significant predictors of women offending and incarceration. We also know that Oklahoma has the highest rate of female incarceration in the world. What does this mean to you, and how do you think we begin to address the issue? Sorry.
So this is why I came to the state of Oklahoma, trying to understand this whole concept. And to steal a line from a mentor of mine, Susan Sharp, which, the women here are not just meaner, right? You cross the border to Texas or Arkansas or Kansas, and women here are not more criminal. However, we lock women up in a way that other states don't. And if we look, so I'm gonna make 2 quick points. One of those, in the research that we've done with these incarcerated women, we know that trauma is such a massive indicator of their trajectory toward the criminal justice system. We also know incarcerated women, almost 80%, between 75 and 80% of the women who are incarcerated in Oklahoma were in a violent relationship at the time that they caught their charge. And we know that those relationships were not just physically violent, that coercive control was present at astronomical levels. The threats and demands made about their behavior in a daily way, everything from child rearing to the illegal substances that they used, to parts about their work. So that kind of constant control is very real and a major issue. We have that in our clinical world. We also have a policy issue and a thing in Oklahoma that doesn't exist in other places. So across the country, if a man and a woman commit the same crime, there's this concept that we talk about in academic circles of benevolent sexism, that women will be protected somehow in the court system in ways that men aren't. In Oklahoma, that is flipped. If a man and a woman do the same crime, the woman will be more harshly judged and punished. So there's a sociological construct in our culture in this state that holds women to a different standard than it does men. And I think that when women experience problems or don't live up to a certain particular standard that's set up in our culture of the state, that they become very much throwaway people who need to be punished or put back in line. In that scenario, the state and our culture is abusive toward women. So we've got multiple things to try to unpack and figure out how to do here. And we've got to find ways to dig into the ways that that culture influences our criminal justice policy. Because that disadvantages women in a really particular way here, in a way that's unique and we don't see in other parts of the country. Now I'll be quiet.
Does anyone have anything they want to add to that?
Danielle, how do you follow that?
I know, it's hard. It's the professor coming out.
I know, right? I get to practice this stuff.
It shows.
Thank you.
So we had a question come from one of the attendees, from Kinsey. So she asked, since the majority of women who are incarcerated have experienced domestic violence and or sexual assault in their lifetime, do y'all feel that correctional facilities for women should operate with a more trauma-informed mindset? And what changes might you recommend to minimize re-traumatization?
Absolutely, 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 yes. All of the things. So one, I don't think women should be getting locked up like that. The right kind, we understand and know how diversion works. We can use diversion related activities to drastically reduce the amount of incarcerated or warehoused women in our community. We know that substance abuse works. We know that social support wraparound services, this stuff works. We also know that women who are involved in the criminal justice system have these complex lives that are full of trauma from start to finish. Right? So using trauma-informed approaches in those diversion strategies would lead to a natural attrition in the incarceration of women in the state. Secondly, for the facilities that do exist, just being more trauma-informed in how those facilities operate on a day-to-day basis. Keep in mind, if over 3/4 of the women who are incarcerated would fit diagnostic criteria for PTSD, yet they have doors slamming all the time. They're pushed around, scared, like you stay continually triggered. It almost comes across as if you want return customers in the system. So if it really is about rehabilitation, then you've got to change that entire paradigm. And trauma-informed, we know enough about trauma-informed work now to know that that is absolutely the step forward. So good feedback on that one. And the short answer is absolutely yes.
Mm-hmm. I personally think we should put more money into the treatment and the things that can really shift the lives of not just women, but a number of individuals versus, the facilities that hold, our inmates. Not stating that they don't need the funding, but I'm curious to know what it would look like if we were able to treat these individuals with the care that they actually need, instead of just housing them and producing more trauma within their lives.
I think that extends to upon their release as well, because if they have trauma prior to incarceration and in constant trauma while incarcerated, and then we look at how most individuals are treated post-release, they may not have a home to go back to, a family or a support system, but they have dealt with all of this trauma they're without a break while they're incarcerated. And looking at how we can support them prior to their release, but then immediately after their release, because I know some of the clients that I had worked with that had been incarcerated, part of why they went back to an abusive situation or went back to a partner, they felt like they didn't have a support system outside of that relationship. And that was not as scary as being on their own, but also what other options were presented to them, and really a trauma-informed approach, but also building them up so they knew that when they got out that they had resources, a community, because again, like we said, we have all these amazing wraparound services, but following them throughout, so we don't have someone who is caught in the cycle of incarceration, as well as a cycle of violence on top of that.
Absolutely. And we know that recidivism is such a real problem in our system everywhere, but in Oklahoma particularly. So the likelihood that these women will go back to prison is really, really high. I mean, we're talking, depends on the metric you look at, anywhere from 40 to 70%. Lots of different metrics to look at, right? But what we do know too is that when we look at the data show us that women are more relational, and that sense of community is really important. We know that if a man goes to prison, the likelihood that his partner will be there waiting for him when he gets out is relatively high. We know if a woman goes to prison, the likelihood that her partner will be waiting for her when she gets out is relatively low. So she gets out, and then what have we done to actually help support, grow, and nurture healthy support systems and relationships for her? Because if you get out and you're hurting as a human being, we need connection. And so you're going to reach out to who's available to connect with. And we know that a lot of these women had any of their connections kind of leave them behind due to their criminal justice system involvement. So if you, we're all human beings, right? So we need that support, that connection, partnership, friendship, whatever it is. And when they come out and don't have it, then they find themselves in the exact same situations where people can be predatory, and they find themselves in those exact same types of relationships. And we, the data show us, we know it's coming. So the fact that we don't take that into account and try to build in really healthy relationship programming, social support development as a part of the diversion, the healing process, and reentry. The fact that we don't do it's just kind of, I'll use the word silly to me, but there are lots of words we could use to describe it.
Anyone else have anything they want to add? So how do prisons recreate the power and control dynamic that we see in domestic violence relationships? Great question, Cindy.
I'm itching for this. You want to go? You want to go?
It's all you. I'll bounce off of you.
I'm itching. I'm on a roll with this coming down on the prison industrial complex. Prisons, in their very nature, the way that they control the movement of human beings from room to room, the constant counts, every aspect of your life is controlled when you're on the inside. If we look at what the research has shown us over the past couple of years and the connections in domestically violent relationships to coercive control and the day-to-day threats and demands that are made about every behavior and action that a woman experiences, or man, but typically we're talking about women in these situations, it's like they're trading one abusive relationship for the other. The prison system just builds on the same exact concepts to control behavior. One of the things that when we went into the prisons to talk to incarcerated women, one of the only ways we were able to try to help, and I think it was a really powerful way to do it, we talked to them about how every single day you have no choice about when to brush your teeth, where to go, when to go. Right now we get 15 minutes to talk about your experience so I can try to help other women not come here. And how can your story do that? And that moment, the way the light would come on, it gives me chills right now to think about, was the idea that this human being finally had a choice around what they were going to do for 5 minutes. The prison system is an abusive relationship. And I think it's a very important, what a fantastic parallel that you draw there, Cindy, and question that you pose.
I think the other component of that is we also see that isolation. So when we look at the costs for communication in prisons, if they even have phones or video conferencing available in these prisons, cutting women off from the support system they might have, or children, sometimes there's a whole CPS investigation happening while the mom is incarcerated, and she might not be able to attend court dates, to advocate for herself and for her children. So we see that loss of that connection as well. If they do have a support system and they're not able to financially support paying for a 5-minute call, or the prison's no longer offering it, which is very similar in a domestic violence relationship, cutting off that control to their support people, taking their phone away, isolating them from the supportive people in their life, either physically or emotionally. So it is that same of feeling of isolation and not having the option to be in contact with those supportive individuals in their life, or just their family or children.
And then the other thing to add is that you have an individual who leaves this relationship to where every decision was made by the person using violence. Then you go into this setting and every decision is made by, the prison staff. And so you never have that moment in time to where you're able to truly trust yourself again to make any life decision. So you may see an individual, they go into the prison setting, they leave that relationship behind or whatever took place, and then they come out and you expect them to be able to survive on their own and make decisions in life that are going to move them towards their journey of healing. However, they've never had that opportunity to do that. They've never been encouraged to step out on their own and make that decision, or to really enjoy the empowerment that they feel when they're able to do so. So I feel that's another factor too.
Absolutely. Anyone else have anything they want to add or bounce back?
One more thing. How do you truly learn to trust individuals if every time you turn around, something negative is happening to you in life by someone that you trusted? So you had these relationships and they were not individuals that you can trust because harm came. You step into the prison system and you think, well, you know, these are people of authority that they're going to keep me safe too. And you're in that setting and you're not safe there either. So then you come out into the real world and you want to do better, and you have different resources or different referrals that are made for you. But I'm assuming that it's probably difficult to trust those individuals too, because you've never had that trust in, you know, the day-to-day person.
I mean, and the system itself doesn't inspire trust. You're taking somebody who's already been through hell and just telling them you can't trust anybody, right? So like a metaphorical hand raising, like how many of us fully trust the government, right? And we're on this side, we're sitting in this room having conversations over lunch, right? Why would these women trust that their experience will lead them to a positive place if they've been shown over and over again that it feels just as or even more abusive than what they experienced in their relationships and their childhood? But there's a question from Kinsey that I think is really good. I don't want to like hijack and roll.
No,
But this is so good. It's connected to what we're talking about. It's so good. This, as a society, does our focus on punishment as a solution for crime affect our ability to prevent further interpersonal violence? Absolutely. Absolutely. Our social system works on this assumption of scarcity of resources, and I'll take what I want to keep you from, and what happens to you, like it's all retroactive. So we watch that in our culture in Oklahoma. We invest all this energy and time on punishment because you took something of mine, or because I'm scared that you will, rather than reinforcing and helping us all be stronger and pulling and do things together. The entire system, even in I've seen some great research too on the way that the actual court system works. So many of these women come into the court system after experiencing violence in childhood, violence in relationships, then they don't have the money. They get a public defender who then will tell them, this is the best deal you're going to get. I'm an expert and you're not. So they take plea deals they shouldn't. And we see that the system is set up to punish, not to rehabilitate or to give people a chance to grow, to make things right. All the way, courtrooms included.
Anyone else have anything they want to add to that question about how we use punishment as a way to respond? So what impact does incarcerating an individual have on the family unit as a whole?
You're just raising everyone's ACE scores. Everyone gets ACE, you get an ACE, you get an ACE, you get an ACE for a number of different things across the board. So let's look at it if mom is taken out the picture. So if mom is incarcerable, if mom is in a relationship that has domestic violence, that's an ACE. If mom responds to this domestic violence in a way that leads to her being taken away, going to prison, that's an ACE because mom is removed from the picture. If mom is removed from the picture, a lot of, moms are very protective over their children. And so their children may go to different environments, which may not have those same protective factors. So a child can be placed in an environment to where there's abuse. A child can be placed in an environment to where sexual abuse can occur. And once again, we're continuously raising ACE scores. And so it's just a never-ending cycle of high ACE scores and experiences that an individual has to process throughout their life journey, and they may or may not do that in the healthiest way.
Just going off of that, truly thinking of the children as well, on top of the ACEs and the trauma, but that's also disrupting their life, their level of comfort that they know. If they are having to stay, let's say there's a sibling group, but they're not able to stay together. So you might have some siblings that are with grandma, some might be with an aunt and an uncle. They might even have to go to different states, depending on what family members are able to support the children. So now they've lost a parental figure, but they've also lost their sibling group and that support. And when we look at that trauma of feelings of abandonment, personal feelings of guilt or shame that children have if they have experienced abuse or they have witnessed abuse, that they did something, or maybe if they just did, clean their room when they were supposed to, all of these things, because again, they're children and they don't have the same life experiences that we do as adults, or sometimes a perspective to look outside of the situation. So that's changing their trajectory. And it could also be feelings, again, of mistrust, and fear of harm from people that were supposed to protect them and support them. So, it really is changing sometimes that entire family dynamic, sometimes forever, depending on what the situation is. And if there were supportive people that could come in and take care of the children, sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes they do end up going into foster care. And in those situations, I have had clients where they lost custody of their children while they were incarcerated. They didn't have a say in that process. And so that's a whole other trauma on top of everything that's happened of permanent displacement from their family group.
I'd say it's, I think it kind of goes without saying that it's not okay to hurt your child or allow your child to be hurt. So nobody's making that argument. And maybe you all are way more well-adjusted than I am, but there is not a perfect parent, right? Everybody's trying to do the best they can typically. And what's that old line from the old book? Let he who's without sin cast the first stone, right? I'm just saying, right? So when we come into contact with if you look at this from the psychology of the child, that separation from their parental figure, there is a massive traumatic blow. And it sets these kids up for a failure to be able to trust anybody and anything. So even a parent that is not perfect is still very important to a child. And so when we lock these people up, or we take these women and lock them up in Oklahoma at these crazy rates, we are creating a cycle, and we know exactly what's going to happen. Just like Brittni was saying, we're helping dish out the trauma and the ACEs, and we know exactly, the data is very clear. These kids are at super high risk from then on, and we don't have the services. We have a Children of Incarcerated Parents Legislative Committee that I'm lucky to be able to serve on. And we know that any given time in Oklahoma, today, as we sit in this meeting, there are probably 26,000-ish kids who have a locked up parent. The state provides resources for about 60 of those kids today. So we know who the kids at the highest risk is. We know right now. And as a state, we do nothing for them. And very little anyway. So it's really profound, the effect that this has on children.
Going off of that it brings the point of, what does that do for the children and their relationship with the juvenile justice system, the justice system in general? Oftentimes when children are having traumatic responses that could be engaging in risky behaviors, running away from home, having difficulty in school, and then we look at how those children are punished. So changing that perspective of, let's get to the root of where this trauma is coming from. Is this a trauma response? And bringing those supports in. But unfortunately, in many instances, the child is then punished for their actions. So we can see that this cycle can start in that next generation at an even younger age, time after time. So it's also being cognizant of how that's affecting that child and their trajectory the rest of their life, as they become involved in juvenile delinquency systems and then the justice system when they become an adult.
You know, Tara, it triggered a number of past experiences that I've had with children in the school system when they displayed behaviors that were not ideal. And I remember having a conversation with one of the teachers and one of the vice principals on why I had the interaction I had with this particular child and why the conversation went so well. And one of the things that I shared with them is that the behavior that was displayed is not who this child is as an individual. And behavior is just their cry for help and for you to figure out exactly what's going on. And so one of the magical questions that I would ask is, help me understand what happened, or help me understand this. And when you present things in that manner, in a trauma-informed way, you're not villainizing that child. You're just simply trying to get a better understanding. And I think if a number of professionals across the board had that same lens of help me understand, then we can probably move further along and move away from, institutionalizing everyone that makes a choice or displays a behavior that may not be ideal.
Absolutely. So we had a couple of questions in the chat. The first one comes from Anita. She asked, what are some measures that can be taken to best disrupt the intergenerational cycle of trauma in the family units? Kind of built off from somebody sharing that they worked in CPS and witnessed a lot of that cycle, trying to figure out how to help as well.
Sorry. You normalize that treatment. When behaviors are displayed, or when you are when you're removing those kids from those type of environments, you automatically introduce a different way of actually responding or coping or healing from that type of experience. The children who are introduced into the counseling aspect or that treatment aspect at a young age, there's a chance that they normalize, they get comfortable with that. And so when they become parents, they gather and they use the tools that were presented to them, and we're hoping that they carry it on. There are a number of different schools who are really recognizing the importance of bringing treatment into the school and responding to certain behaviors with treatment styles and counseling and group and things along those lines to produce a different outcome from these children. So the hope is, by everyone getting connected with the resources that we have available, where we're removing all of those barriers of like income or the insurance carriers and things along those lines, that we can get them what they need, starting at a very younger age. And even like with those children, they have parents. And so whenever I know that we would have counseling sessions, those parents were included as well. And so not only was I able to produce or provide tools for that child, but I was able to introduce some of those tools to those parents. And so the things that they were not able to get when they were younger, they were able to grasp at an older age, and it still spills over into all the family.
And I think like you raised every point really, but that early intervention is so important. And as adults who work with children or who are around children, have children in our lives, to know those signs and build that relationship with children, to be able to have open conversations. What's been going on? How are you feeling? How are you doing? Creating a trusting and safe environment for children to share and to feel comfortable sharing without fear of getting in trouble, without fear of harm, to be that supportive person. And having access for children, creating access for children to be involved in things, whether that's a sport, an after school activity, a youth group, just to have that other sense of community. And by being able to offer as many options as possible, either therapeutic or for hobby for children, that's huge, especially with these early interventions. If we have children that maybe, again, that caregiver or someone at home isn't that safe person that they can share, but they are struggling and they have things that they want to share, creating that environment and help foster that community outside of the child, and not waiting until it is to the point where the child is involved with the juvenile justice system, or they are having severe difficulty in school and behavioral issues, like doing it way before that so they feel safe and they know a comfortable person that they can share with.
See, my colleagues have covered the clinical basis. I agree with everything they're saying. I don't know that I have much value to add there. I would say in the more meso and macro spaces, working with so many wonderful people in Oklahoma, I know there are lots of great programs. There are lots of great clinicians, lots of great people. We need to do a better job of networking so that we can quickly access and broker our clients and people that we need to serve to those in their geographic areas, or those that are able to get them. So whether that's using something that exists like the Be a Neighbor program website or other similar strategies, we've got to find a way to communicate and get folks to the help in an organizational way. And then in the really macro space, we got to vote. Policy matters. So at the end of the day, if we're still locking up parents like this, we should expect to see hurt children. So we get to make choices, and we need to help people who may feel disenfranchised become more engaged in the political process. That stuff matters, because that's how budgets get. The people who make choices about how to spend budgets are where we need representation.
That's a very good point. I'm curious to know what it would look like if we had a budget to put a curriculum in the school system to where children learn how to cope in a healthy way, and they're able to learn, about triggers and how to apply the tools that we have in those individual counseling sessions from the very beginning. Imagine the adults that would come from those set of kids.
So you mentioned budgets. What does it look like for us to begin shifting from more of a reactionary criminal justice system to something that's more proactive and aimed at prevention?
There are actually some pretty strong strategies on how to make a transition. You got to do it. You have to do it in a way that's apolitical, that doesn't contribute to a decline in public safety. You make sure you sell it the right way and explain to folks. But what we've learned from the research is 3 major steps that feed each other. One is active evidence-based diversion. So finding ways to keep people from becoming a part of the carceral state in the first place. The second step is following natural attrition in carceral spaces. This is where we start making our money. If you had a facility that had 100 beds and now you only need 70 beds, you've got 30 beds worth of money. We're not asking for new tax dollars. We want to repurpose. The third phase is to repurpose. And so we're repurposing that money into strategies that will help people re-enter and support future diversion, which leads us back to the front, and it actually increases our diversion game. Increase the diversion game, we should increase the attrition game. We should have more available resources. So it's doable. People have done it in other places. And I think that those are we have to be ready to engage in those strategies. Now, I love the fact that we had some commutations in the state a while back. Even the colleagues that we have in DOC who really care about reentry were scared to death that the commutations, that people wouldn't have the supports they needed on reentry and would find their way back to the system. And politically, if we see efforts like that fail, then it builds momentum against criminal justice reform. So we don't want to give the haters any reason to say this won't work. So we need to be smart, be tactical about it.
Anyone else have anything they want to add? No. So in what ways are poverty and trauma criminalized here in Oklahoma?
Quite a few. I think that goes without saying. I think we all know. I think when we look in general at what neglect looks like, and how that affects families, children, and how that's often criminalized, especially when we look at homelessness. What trauma, what experiences led to experiencing homelessness? What led to not having enough food for your children, a safe place for them to be, safe environment, people, clothing, medication, healthcare, all of these things that we need to provide for children, and then we need for ourselves. When we look at the penalties associated with that, it's not equitable across the board from who is experiencing these penalties. And then when you look at individuals experiencing poverty and also interacting with the criminal justice system, you have a lot of legal fees. Who's going to be able to afford that? We have wonderful agencies in Oklahoma, especially in the metro, that are able to provide legal assistance for individuals, but that's not going to cover the need that we have. So it's a good start. But when we look at the individuals that they would have had a really great chance of not having a penalty or being incarcerated if they were able to afford quality legal representation, if they even knew what was available to them. But money is a huge barrier for a lot of these resources, and just the comforts of, if I lost my home tomorrow, what would my support network be? What could I dip into? But I have that security. How is that criminalized and penalized for other individuals that don't have the same experiences or resources to pull from that I do? So that, I know my colleagues definitely have, more insight to give, but that's just what comes to my mind.
Yeah, I think rich people go to court and poor people go to prison. I mean, it's the system itself, and understand how the system is constructed in Oklahoma right now. Your prosecutor's office keeps its lights on through fees and fines. Your public defenders are in the same boat. They keep their lights on by keeping people in the system. So, and once you're in, you become a slave to the system. And it is unbelievable. And they set you up for failure to appear and failure to pay fines, which then exponentially compound on top. So you pay for your own probation, you pay everything, there's a fine and a fee. So when you ask, do we criminalize poverty? Absolutely, because even somebody with sound economic resources can't afford to pay all those fines and fees. So how would you even be able to afford an attorney? And if you can't, I mean, think about the context of, there are good attorneys. There are people that are trying in our public defender's office, for example, they're trying. And their caseloads are so overwhelming that they do not have time to prep for a case. So if you pay for your attorney, they have time to prep your case and give you good prepared representation. If you have a public defender, might be a great person with a great heart and a good attorney, but if they don't have time to prepare your case, then you don't stand the same chances. And it's just data. It's straight up data. The system overwhelmingly not only favors whiteness, but also favors wealth. And we know that in the data, and it's just, what are we going to do about it?
Anyone else have anything they want to add? So we've talked a little bit about the lack of resources for people who are incarcerated once they're released. What barriers does that create, and how does that perpetuate the cycle?
So lack of resources. If we have an individual who has been released from prison, there's a chance that there's probably a charge on them. A number of individuals who have felony charges, we know that it's really challenging to land a quality job. So if we don't have a quality job, you have some individuals that get really creative with how they make their money, which increase the chances of them going back. So that's one angle to look at it.
And we'd already kind of talked about it a little bit, but social capital. Who can you rely on in your networks of people for friendships? I heard this great line that incarcerated women, the dating pool for incarcerated women is very shallow. So as you go out to find consistency or companionship, support, where are you able to identify that? So those social systems and support systems, I think, are really problematic oftentimes. Not to mention the mental health, substance abuse, all the other stuff that people need, job, all the things. And I mentioned the fines earlier. Like, just because you get out of prison, then you have to start paying it back. In Oklahoma, you start paying a bill, and if you don't pay your prison bill, they're coming to get you to send you back.
There are also barriers for housing. There are a lot of apartments or renters that will not take anyone who has had a felony or any convictions. So that drastically makes the pool even smaller, even if this individual does have money, or if they have a housing voucher from working with a program, but then where they're able to, let's say, use that voucher is extremely limited based on if they have a conviction or felonies. And so that also creates a massive barrier of, they've put in so much work to be able to attain housing, but now they're being turned away by all of these, apartments or landlords. So what does that say about how they feel about the work they've put in, the progress they've made in their own treatment and their life post-incarceration, if now they are holding this money or this voucher and there are not individuals that are willing to house them? And I know, like, with housing first, that whole model, let's get you into a safe place first, and then we'll continue to build on the services that you need, whether that's substance abuse, mental health, trauma, all of these things. But if you can't even get that because of your incarceration, then what are we doing to really change that? And I think that's a huge thing that we can just keep in mind. And we're talking about policy and advocating for change. That's a huge one.
You just brought up another point. If we have this state that has the highest women's incarceration rate, and we have limited resources to meet their needs, imagine if a large number of individuals are released at one time and they're gravitating towards those few resources that we have. Someone's going to get left behind. And guys, we're talking basic needs: housing, food. These are basic needs. Mm-hmm. And so then it sends that individual into survival mode. And the choices that you make when you're simply trying to survive may not be ideal.
That's a fantastic point. And our system, and we probably have many service providers on the page today, right? Our system is already overwhelmed. We see a massive influx of people in the 80s, right? After the deinstitutionalization movement of mental health. those people didn't go, they became homeless and they came into the criminal justice system. There wasn't like magically nobody had mental health concerns. And so the criminal justice system serves as a mental health system as well. And so there's a saturation in service delivery. So when people get out, just as it is right now, our service delivery providers are overwhelmed. So everybody needs help and support. But if we end up triaging those with the strongest mental health or substance abuse needs, we got all these other people here that would have gotten those services before, but now can't get access to those services as well. So that saturation and overwhelming the system is a major barrier that we're seeing.
So what does it look like for somebody who has been incarcerated? Does those barriers of having a criminal history impact their ability for certain resources like mental health and substance use services? And we've talked a little bit about housing, but what limitations can that create?
I think the only limitation that I can think of is like when it comes to an individual and they may have like a charge that's around like a sexual offense. So like I know we may have had some situations to where we had a survivor to come in, and of course we run those records, and if they've had a sexual offense, then we can only handle certain parts of the case. When it comes to housing, you can't have them in certain neighborhoods. Even like when it comes to treatment, like imagine if you have this parent that has this sexual offender charge and you're wanting them to engage in treatment like with their child or in a setting to where other children are near. Well, we have to make different choices or figure out a way around it, because we still have to keep everyone in mind when it comes to safety. So I know that plays a role. I mean, that's the only charge I can really think of, that and maybe like an aggravated assault to where it's really major. Those two charges are what come to mind. So that's the way that it can really get in the way of actually getting that treatment.
Anyone else have anything they want to add? So according to Palomar, they ran some numbers and only about 2% of the people who actually commit domestic violence even receive prison time. So we also know that we have some really high rates of incarceration in Oklahoma. So that leads kind of the question of who is being incarcerated.
Unfortunately, the survivor. That survivor responds, and you may have a survivor that responds and they, do something physical to that person using violence or that person that's been mentally tormenting them, and they've received the consequence, unfortunately. And so I remember sitting in on, I was a mental health consultant prior to this role. And I remember sitting in on a case and mom had responded to something that dad had displayed and that he had been doing. And she was the one that was receiving all of the redirection and all of the recommendations. And I had to literally step out to have a conversation with the worker to paint a different picture of, I really don't think that she's the aggressor. I think that we may be dealing with this, this, and this. And I was happy to be a part of that meeting to really present that information, because imagine how that meeting could have went had I not provided that different lens. So it's unfortunate. I mean, we stated from the very beginning that our incarceration rates for women are extremely high, and a good portion of those women come from relationships to where there was domestic violence. And they were either trying to protect themselves, or they've had enough, or they were trying to protect their children, because we also know that those children are used to get reactions from those parents as well.
When it wasn't until November of this past year where domestic violence was considered a violent crime in Oklahoma. So that was a huge difference in what they were actually able to charge individuals with. There still are some caveats for stalking, for sexual assault, for strangulation, and also one of the biggest things that I saw when I was a domestic violence advocate was oftentimes those charges were hung upon, would the victim testify? Would they go and face their abuser and in court? And if they weren't ready to do that, weren't able to, that could be used against them. Of, well, then we have no case, we're going to throw this out, or we have nothing else, and could make a huge argument on why that's why expert witnesses are so important to have testimony, but a lot of that was also contingent upon, were they able to go and testify, and it's a really unfair situation to put, of course, someone in who has just experienced this trauma and this violence, and oftentimes my clients did not want to go and testify because they knew even if their abuser was charged, they might be released early on good behavior, or the prisons were too full, so they were commuting individuals. So that fear was in the back of their mind as well of, do I want to put myself in this situation and testify when I know that in 2 years, this is going to be even worse, because now the severity and the threat has just increased exponentially. So a lot of that weight is being put on the very person that as service providers, we're trying to empower and protect and lift up and keep them safe.
Be mindful that you have the family of the person using violence as well as their friends. So we've had cases to where retaliation, it was used from the friends of the person using violence. So that's another factor.
When it's also very difficult from a policy perspective. We find ourselves, when we are both advocates for criminal justice reform and advocates for victim services or survivor services, we find ourselves in the policy world in competition. And that makes it really difficult to find policy and create law that will both empower and support and protect survivors and reform the criminal justice system. We saw that happen in Oklahoma right pre-COVID, right? We were really in our own community of service providers and people who care about these things. We were seeing a lot of tension and conflict of perspective. And it just speaks to the complexity of providing services is one thing. Creating policy can be more complicated because everybody's situation can be a little bit different. The criminal justice system too, when we see that part of that problem, that gap between the initial calls and who makes it through to consequence, there are some pieces of just relationship dynamics in general. Many of the survivors don't necessarily want to see their abuser in prison. So many do, many do not. And that makes it even more complicated. So what is it, as we explore what is justice and what is safety and what is our role, it's a lot more complicated than our existing system even, and the tools that our system has. So hopefully people out there can help us fix some of this stuff, because there's a lot of complexity to unpack.
Going off of that last point that you had made, it is so true that there were times where my client didn't want to see the abuser in prison. And I think that also opens up the more broad conversation around how comfortable are we as the general public around that dynamic? And how does that change the trajectory of this case and our personal feelings and the policy around these charges? Because if we look at, maybe it isn't even the fear, this is my co-parent. We have children together. We have a life together. So that's a dynamic that already exists in the power and control wheel and in domestic violence relationships. But when we add the criminal aspect to it, that's a huge component. And are people comfortable having that conversation with both parties of, I actually understand that you don't want to have this person be in trouble, go to prison, have charges, and why you might not want to participate. and having the open mind and the willingness as service providers to also provide that support, because it looks so different.
It
I
speaks.
think that's what.
Oh, my apologies. I'll quickly say it and get out of the way. I think it speaks to part of our problem of expecting a criminal justice system alone to be the remedy for a major social problem. That is one tool that we have, but it does not speak to the needs. If we really believe in the autonomy, the dignity, and self-determination of people, then how do we serve these folks that really just want the violence to end? They want a healthier relationship. Is it true? Is it not? How does that change our idea of who we are? Like when I started my whole pathway in this professional life, I thought I was riding in on a white horse and saving people. And right, that's what I wanted to do. I want to be a hero, man. And it's just not what it is. But we all struggle, when we're imposing our ideas onto our clients, we find ourselves in this spot. It's uncomfortable. I'm glad Tara brought that up. It's uncomfortable to try to, how do we serve when the goals that the client initiates are not what we feel like is healthy or safe for them?
I honestly think that our survivors that we're serving, they know what's helpful for them. And I think it's simple. You just meet them where they're at. If they want to leave, then what does that look like? If you still love this person and you want to stay, what does that look like for you to be safe? We're going to meet you wherever you're at. And I think if we all put on that lens, I think we could probably move further along.
Absolutely. So Kinsey asked, would policies that address poverty, education, and mental health gaps be considered policies that would create safety from the perspective of both survivor and criminal justice advocates? Criminal reform advocates. Sorry, it moved.
I think the data is clear that if you relieve the strain and stress of life in general, that better outcomes will happen. My research for 20 years, I've been trying to figure out why people hurt each other and how to stop it. Well, we know that hurt people, right? So there are Jeffrey Dahmers in the world. That is not most of what happens. That is such an extreme outlier. People in crisis do bad things or hurt others. Any of us here is so close to that crisis right now, and we don't even realize it. Maybe you do realize we are right there. We're not that different. Human beings in crisis will do whatever they have to do in that moment to try to find control of their life. And that's how we see violence develop. So the more we can create a society and systems that alleviate stress and pressure for things that we can control, the residual effects will come over into safety. I genuinely believe that I believe in the better angels of our nature, right? That you relieve poverty, we work on some of these other areas that will transition into the home and the relationship.
Anyone else? We had a couple of questions from Timber, and the first question they asked was, can we even serve the community properly and provide authentic support for people in our current criminal justice system?
I think we can. I think that every single one of us in this, in this Zoom, this webinar, sound like my mom right now. I think all of us, we have seen ourselves work on both sides. And I don't think it's linear. I think that we can see both perspectives and still want to be able to serve both sides. Where your heart primarily lies might not be, on both sides. It could be more than one than the other, but I think we can properly serve the community to provide support and services for both. Just like there are going to be some people that really love art, some people really love math. I think it's the same concept that we can, but it's coming to that understanding and having these more broad conversations with both sides to how can we serve both sides in a way that's going to be best for our community, our neighborhood, our service area, and for the primary clients that we have, and keeping that communication open. We might not always agree, but we both know that we're trying to reach the same, understanding and the same goal, even if it looks different. Or that just could be the real big optimist in me that keeps me coming in every day, but that's what I think.
Anyone want to add on that?
Tara wrapped it up in a bow. I agree.
Okay. And the next question that Timber asked was, do you think that we have to find alternative solutions to justice because we can't rely on our current system to rehabilitate? And I would add on to that, like, what do those alternative solutions look like right now when we don't have a lot of options policy-wise?
I get asked this question or similar ones often, and I would say we have to. I encourage us all to explore what justice means and what it can look like. It's not to say that our criminal justice system isn't one important part of the solution, but we've depended on that one solution to solve a problem that's much bigger than that. And like, dude, you can use a rake to move a pile of dirt, but it's probably easier if you use a shovel. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it is a tool, it is helpful, it serves a purpose. Is it the right one for this and other things? Sometimes, yes. A lot of times, no. And so what do we as a community, as a society, how do we envision our role in finding justice for people? And how do we set up the system so that we can complement and not overuse the criminal justice system in ways that it was never really intended, in ways that we know by the evidence it's not effective and efficient at working.
Anyone want to add to that? Okay. We'll ask one last question and we will wrap up. So how does growing up in a home with domestic violence impact children?
I think it's how doesn't it? There are so many ways that it impacts children, and it might not look the same from one household to another, but this is not only modeling behaviors for them of how we handle stress, how we handle anger, and how we have conflict resolution, what a loving relationship looks like, and also just the fundamental need to be loved and supported and what that looks like. Of course, we have interventions, and that's the best thing we can do to give those healthy foundations, but it's absolutely going to change that child's life and trajectory, even if we think, well, they didn't see all the domestic violence, or they didn't hear anything, or maybe they were too young to really know what's going on. There are still so many ways, just from housing insecurity, moving around place to place, having a parent that's incarcerated. I mean, it's every single way.
Epigenetics come to mind too, and we kind of talk about some of that. So does anybody want to talk a little bit about that?
I'd say epigenetics, particularly in regards to the onset of all types of maladaptive situations or disorders. We know from the research that violent or traumatic, or that we can have individuals who are not genomically expressing really serious mental health concerns or issues. And that being involved in violent relationships, traumatic experiences, or exposures to prolonged stress will activate or express those traits. So the brain is a wonderfully powerful and wild kind of thing, right? So these relationships are not only bad for your physical health, emotional health. But once those, if we, schizophrenia, for example, if we use that as an example, once that starts to express, there are very few documented cases that it's going away, right? You might control your symptoms, but now you're working to manage this. PTSD is very real, and there's such a spectrum of experiences with this, right? But once your brain has been set up to release hormones to keep you safe, you can't turn that off, right? So you have to learn how to manage that in time. So there's some things that are just natural evolutionary reactions that we have. Other things that are like those epigenetic scenarios are really interesting. And these types of stressful or traumatic situations can make life much more challenging for any human being.
Does anyone have anything they want to add to that? Well, panelists, do you have any closing thoughts or remarks that you would like to share?
I just like to say thank you to my colleagues up here. This has been a great conversation, and I just really appreciate the opportunity to be on the panel with you.
I've enjoyed my experience as well. I've learned quite a bit too.
Yes, definitely. It's been an amazing opportunity. I appreciate everyone who's here, especially lots of things that I'm going to go back and research and look up. So thank you for that. And I think just the more general for every single person, you don't have to work at a child advocacy center, DV, at a university. I mean, we all literally play a part in these systems and advocating for change. So find those people, find those connections, because we're all in this state, so we all have a say in what we want to change.
And then just be mindful with how you engage with others. We all have a story. And so just imagine if we all present with that trauma-informed lens day to day, and what that can truly do and the impact it will have on the person that you're crossing paths with.
I'd like to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to have this conversation with us and to kind of share from different perspectives what that looks like in your roles. And again, I want to thank all of both the panelists and the people who came in to attend, so that we're not just talking to ourselves. So that's always nice too. But